Hello, Data Storytellers. Today, we're here with Aaron Fossum, who's the Senior Director of Digital Analytics over at Norwegian. So Aaron has a really extensive background in data and analytics and digital. And today, we're going to be touching on blending the art and science of data, specifically using Agile methodology. And I'm sure we'll get into this, but a topic that is kind of been pushed aside for the sexiness of data, but actually just as important. So I don't want to take away your thunder too much. Aaron, great to have you with us.
Hey, thanks, Paul. It's great to be here.
Awesome stuff. So just to give the audience a bit of context to start with, tell us a bit about your background, your role, some of the previous jobs you worked at, how it led you to this current role you're in.
Yeah, I've been really blessed to start in the web analytics industry really when it was in its infancy. I came out of school in 1999 and I had applied for a job as a network administrator because everybody was becoming a network administrator, making ridiculous salaries right out of school. And I got a call back that said, we don't think you're really a fit for a network administrator. I thought they were calling to rub it in, make fun of me or something like that. I said, but we got this other thing. And this other thing turned out to be parsing web analytics logs. And at that time, it was a really end to end because it was brand spanking new. So you'd be working, doing everything from briefing the CEO, the startup to on what's happening on the website to getting in there and parsing log files using tools like SQL and Perl and things like that. So been able to grow up with the industry and it's been a great ride.
Yeah, so can you tell us a bit more about like the early days of the journey and the companies you're working for, the kind of things you were doing there?
Yeah, so I started out with my first job. The one I mentioned was a small online magazine. At a time, it was kind of the end of the dot-com bubble. That was short-lived as the company got acquired by another company that went out of business about 3 months later. So I went and actually worked as a contractor actually at Microsoft for a while. So I got to see some big enterprises. Worked on a data mining team when it was still called data mining versus what we now know as data science. Moved on from there and had a number of other roles at various software vendors. Eventually landed, I took a brief detour to run a graphic design studio with my wife, which was a real hoot. Gradually ended up working at Adobe and had a really great ride with Adobe. And then a friend of mine said, hey, we'd like you to stand up a consulting practice and build up an analytics consulting practice. And that's kind of where my career went from there. Spent some time in the consulting business, kind of back and forth a little bit, and then eventually got into the cruise industry. And I found out I really love selling cruises. So that's where I am now.
Yeah, amazing. And I know that Norwegian is based in beautiful, sunny Miami, which is a little better weather than where we are now in the Pacific Northwest. So yeah, I can imagine that has the appeal to it too. So just tying it back into the data side of things. So you mentioned that there's kind of all this lingo going around, dot-com bubble. And then probably the last decade that's changed, and actually it's changed a lot since the start of the decade and now where we sit today. So I guess I'd be interested to know, what are you seeing in like the big global trends, transformation in the data industry meaning the data leaders at these big companies? Yeah, what kind of trends and stuff are you seeing there?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, it's interesting because a lot of the trends I see today are actually the manifestations of trends we have been hoping for a decade or longer. This idea of analytics moving from being descriptive, telling about what happened, to being more prescriptive, more forecasting. The term nowcasting becoming more popular in my world. Like, what do we think is going to happen? Maybe not over the next year, but over the next month, and what can we do about it? Being a little bit more prescriptive about what we might do and informing the actual actions versus just reporting what happened. Most of the trends I see happening really line up to that kind of idea of moving toward a more predictive model of analytics versus a looking back.
And obviously a lot of the older companies that have kind of been around since the 20th century and maybe aren't as the tech natives like your Apples and your Googles. So when we're talking about these particular organizations, and there's thousands, if not tens of thousands of them globally, who, these big corporate companies who make a lot of money, but they're not really leveraging the power of data. So my question to you would be, what do you think defines a data-driven company? How do you go about identifying that? And what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think what defines a data-driven company is the same thing as what defines a great data analyst. They ask great questions, and then they seek, with some level of scientific rigor, data-driven answers from them. Meaning, for example, I would say we're blessed to work for a data-driven company, and all the way from our CEO down, they're asking great questions like what do we think is going to happen, for this particular thing, and what data do you have to support it? What conflicting data do you have? It comes from the leadership, and that tends to pervade into a great culture as well. Just asking great questions and low egos, I would say. A data-driven company is a low ego company, because if you're going to, especially in marketing, which is where I run, if you're going to use the data to drive your decisions, then you're going to be wrong about stuff. Like, you've got to start with your gut, but the data is going to tell you that you were wrong. Your hypothesis may be disproven. And so, yeah, great questions and low egos.
Ego's a huge one, and this kind of ties into what I believe is some of the biggest qualities of the best data leaders out there in these big companies today. So, just on the back of that, then, what role do you think data analytics leaders play in these transformations? Whether that's like a head of a function or the CDOs, and all those kind of significant strategic roles.
Yeah, we are fundamentally business consultants, and I think that's where the industry has evolved from, where initially was, hey, get us this number, get us this data, building reports, and really now sitting side by side with those leaders to pursue initiatives, to brainstorm, bring data to inform those conversations. We really sit alongside those leaders in a consultative fashion now.
And this kind of ties in with the whole center of excellence idea, right? That you're this internal business consultancy, and consulting can have a million and one different definitions in the software. Maybe a lot of people probably see consultants as kind of like they don't understand the business, they don't really know what they're doing. But if you have a good team, as you said, low ego, asking the right questions, then that's when you can start actually leveraging that power, the power of data, in a real, true, and fundamental way. So, how do you, once you have that internal business consultancy, you have that buy-in because you've been hired and the team has been hired, how do you go about taking those next steps towards, say, asking the right questions? How do you visualize that to the wider business?
I see if I understand the question correctly. Is how do you gain that buy-in, and then how do you put that buy-in into action?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think it starts with context and relationship, and remembering that even though we work with data, it's the people who make the thing work, right? It's the people who are making the decisions. So it's all about people. So it's kind of cheesy to say, but people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So investing in relationships, even though that's not a report, but investing in relationships, and out of those relationships, you'll get better context that helps you fill in the blanks in the data. The data is not going to tell you everything that's going on in the business or why it's going on in the business. You kind of got to understand, what's going on in the business. So getting that context is key too. Once people recognize that you have the relationships, that you've got that low ego, that you ask good questions, and that you have the context to kind of guide, then they'll start seeking your advice and give you permission to help them ask better questions.
And what barriers have you seen in that initial process, in whether it's with Norwegian or with some previous companies as well?
Yeah, it's been great where I'm at right now. In other places, I have observed there is kind of a clinging to that kind of old definition of analytics, where we were kind of a bunch of report jockeys, and as they like go build us a report, and they wouldn't ask great questions or business questions. They would say, go fetch us this number. There is also a tendency to want to add too much value too quickly, and I've made that mistake in my career as well, where it's like, hey, I'm the guy who knows Adobe, been around a while, and I would talk more than I would listen, and so that's another key obstacle, that we can overcome. And then I mentioned it kind of earlier when I talked about low egos, is that a lot of times, especially marketing analytics, the CMO hands you a bag of money and you go spend it on some marketing, and you go say, yeah, that was a waste. is not exactly a great way to advance your career. And so that kind of leads to a tendency to want to make the numbers say what you want them to say. There are ways around all of those things as well, but those are some of the obstacles that I've encountered.
Mm-hmm. And I'd really want to get into this particular idea about where Agile methodology really fits into this. And we did speak about this in a limited way. But before we really take a dive in, you mentioned that you started in this end-to-end role, was like kind of when you were in web analytics, and then when you began leading teams, you were immediately, you said, challenged by these ad hoc requests. So where did Agile really come into this for you, and why should data leaders who are thinking about AI and ML and that's what all the companies thinking about, why should they care about Agile?
Because it's about getting work done. And this is actually one of the things I'm super passionate about, which is totally weird. This data analyst guy, I should love data, I should love reports about it, but I love working in an Agile framework. And it's because even today, analytics teams tend to be very, very lean. And because we're so lean, we're kind of in a unique position where we have a mix of both urgent, do it now, kind of service desk. I call it the reporting desk kind of requests that hey, I'm trying to answer this question. Can you answer this question for me real quick? And then you've got these longer term that they tend to be higher value, but not as urgent kinds of requests. Can you help me understand what elements on this page are working? Can you help design a test around a marketing bid strategy or something like that? And so you've got these short-term and long-term things that have to coexist in the same workflow. And that's kind of unique to the analytics team. Most other teams, if you're a developer, you're working against a roadmap. You have a fairly predictable schedule. If you're IT, right, you're used to dealing with service desk. Analytics does them both. And so I found a way to deploy Agile in a way that really helps balance that.
And it's interesting because it's all about deliverables, right? And as you said, it's very easy as data leaders to get lost in the data, in the science, which is probably more the reporting desk side of things, which is it's very transactional. It's a very flat, in a sense, request. There's not much meat to it. It's just as a problem, it needs to be resolved. It can be resolved relatively quickly. But then actually, when you talk about the larger projects, and as you actually describe them with the high value projects, because the service desk stuff is important, but it's not going to change the fundamentals of the business. Whereas the high value stuff also needs that balance. So that's why I wanted to talk about blending the art and science of data analytics with Agile. So floor is yours now. Tell us about the experiences you've had in leveraging Agile, and then we can run through the playbook.
Yeah, I will say, and I kind of put it into some of the notes that when I first started struggling with the idea of balancing this, report desk type work versus longer term work, one of the first ways I thought was, well, just split the team and have half the team, or what percent of work that, kind of a service desk model, and the other part of the team work more of a project based model. And that's great if you got the people to do it. I have not been blessed to have a team where I've been able to bifurcate workflows in that manner. And most people I've talked to haven't. I've seen it done a couple of times, and it works really well when you have the personnel to do it, but most times you don't. So I've had to run more lean. I will say that my first attempt at running Agile in analytics was a train wreck. Yeah, it was bad. And I was too much focused on the tools and the process and kind of doing Agile for Agile's sake. I focused too much on the data, so I generated these long, cumbersome forms that nobody ever wanted to use, and people hated it. And fundamentally, it didn't help us get the work done, and so it just didn't work well for us. A little bit later, I was blessed to work on a project where I was a TPM, a technical program manager for a data science team. They had a really great Agile workflow already in place, some really good TPMs that preceded me on the project. And it also had the blessing of operating this in a real pure development style environment. So they didn't have quite the same amount of ad hocs that we had before, which gave me kind of a pure laboratory to see how it's really done and what makes Agile. So then I had the opportunity here to put those practices into use. And what I found, having put some of those practices of Agile into use, we could get more into the playbook in a moment, but I was surprised how much Agile has improved team morale. We're doing more work. We're getting more work because good work leads to more work. And that's part of the continuous improvement mentality. So we're doing more work. We're doing better work. People by and large are happier, and we're continually setting records both for our team's throughput, and we're receiving comments from our stakeholders about both the quantity and quality of work. Things like, we don't know how you guys get so much done. Like, we can do more if we get more resources, but but we do a really good job of getting things done. So it's really worked really well for us.
Yeah, a bunch of notes I've been taking here on all that stuff. So when you're working within this corporate beast, and as you said, you're quite a lean team, but there's already this kind of underdog morale as well, because it's almost like people don't expect you to deliver, to have so many deliverables. And how do you go from that level where you are just like a data team, business isn't using data, you're kind of finding all these other functions for, let's say, corporate attention from maybe like the C-suite. How do you go about doing that? And what we're going to talk about actually is actually the deliverable side of things, and how Agile fits into that. The morale booster side of things, really key as well. Obviously, in one big concern of data analytics leaders today is retention. So if you can create a framework and organize that framework in the right way, that you can focus it on not just reporting desk versus high value, but I imagine you also have like quick wins versus the longer term strategies as well, which is really key for that individual engagement. And then, like you said, with the resources, if you're delivering those results, then the resources snowball, and it's kind of like a knock-on effect there.
Yeah. Can you repeat the question?
No question. That was just a quick point I had. Just some points to add in there.
Okay.
You mentioned that good work leads to more work. So that kind of touches what I mentioned there. And actually setting records for throughput and comments. Yes, so the stakeholder engagement and buy-in. Any data analytics projects, and we talk about this on the masterclass as well, isn't going to work without stakeholder buy-in and stakeholder support and stakeholder advocacy. So when we talk about the playbook itself, I'm sure we'll talk about what that framework looks like, but also the results that you've seen from it.
Yeah. So we track sprint points in our tool, and so we are able to monitor how much work we're getting done. Mm-hmm. So that's how we measure the quantity of the work we're doing. The reason that becomes important is because as an analytics team, we serve many different stakeholders, and so for example, our request intake form had over 80 people look at it over the last month, right? Our self-service website has over 2,000 hits on it, right? So we're able to quantify some of these things, even though somebody's interaction with the analytics team may only be once a week or once a month or even less frequently, right? We serve a lot of people. And so being able to quantify the volume of work we're doing is really helpful when building that buy-in and giving some visibility into the pipeline. In terms of quality, most of that we measure more anecdotally, right? How much lift have we been able to generate by aiding more decisions? How often are we being pulled into more strategic conversations? Is the mix of work starting to trend more toward that high value insight generating versus kind of that report desk type things? Mm-hmm. Those are some of the ways that we measure some of the qualitative impacts. So it's a little bit more is a little bit more subjective to measure the quality versus the more objective quantity measurements. But
of course. So let's talk about your playbook then, and how this actually framed. What are some of the considerations, some of the factors, some of the points that you would emphasize to someone, maybe a director or head of VP, who's thinking about leveraging Agile into a data analytics team?
Yeah, I think one of my favorite books is called Start with Why, and I can't remember the author's name of it, but it's really about starting with the why and the mindsets you want to bring to it. Remember, this isn't about Agile. It's not about Jira. It's about getting work done. Agile is a method of doing good quality work at volume with a level of rigor that allows you to predictably deliver results. So it's about getting work done. It's about helping your team prioritize. It's about thoughtfulness. One of the things that I really appreciate about the way we've deployed Agile in this analytics environment is taking the time. We call them ceremonies in sprint language, or in Agile language, it's called ceremonies, and we'll talk about what those are. But to think about what we're doing as a team and why we're doing it, and reflect on it, right? Then this is kind of unique to, in my mind, to deploying Agile for an analytics team versus a development team. It's about managing the interruption. So for analytics, I'll kind of tip the playbook a little bit. You start out with a sprint plan, say, here's the work we're going to do over the next couple of weeks. You never end up doing that work. But what you are able to do is you're able to do a fair volume of that work. And then as you get that interruption coming in saying, hey, can you get me this report real fast? You can then start to immediately trade off. And you're doing this in 2-week bite-sized pieces. So it's about managing the interruption. And then fundamentally, one of my favorite pieces, and I think this is really a morale driver, is about continuous improvement. Part of the Agile process is constantly asking, did I do the right thing, and how could I do it better? So getting work done, being thoughtful, managing interruption, and continuous improvement are kind of the main mindsets and main purposes for doing Agile.
So with the initial engagement then, so actually when you start throwing all these words at people who already live in a vocabulary of words and jargon, what kind of responses do you get on both the positive side and maybe the less positive side, in terms of like excuses or reasons or pitfalls from that?
Yeah, you get pushback from one or two places. One is from the analysts themselves, and one is from your stakeholders. So I'll talk about analysts for a minute, and then we can talk about some of the potential objections you get. And the fact of the matter is, Agile ain't for everybody. One of my good friends and most trusted advisors, actually on his podcast, talked about how Agile isn't always great for analytics teams. And he's right. He's absolutely right. There is a sense amongst many analysts that Agile can constrain creativity. And one of the most important things that a data storyteller is creative. And it's difficult to put that into a 2-week time box. And yet we also owe it to the business to deliver things. So the way Agile works, for me anyway, is it actually enhances our creativity, because we're able to say, this is what's next, give ourselves a date for the next thing. We're going to go get that data. We're going to go look at that data, kind of take more bite-sized pieces, and then assemble them in a way that you don't always know where you're going to end up. You kind of zigzag through the analysis work. So you don't have to think about what, for this research project I'm going to do, what are all the steps I need to do from A to Z. You kind of give that some thought to give yourself some structure, and then you say, we're going to operate this for a couple of weeks, and if it's done, great. If I have other follow-ups, we're going to carry it over to the next sprint. We're going to find the next thing. It helps us to chunk up the tasks, and I find it enhances creativity. But a lot of analysts will say that they're concerned that it constrains creativity. The other thing that people will say is, well, I get in analysts, like, I get so much pressure to do these immediate tasks, and they'll push back against sprints. I prefer a 2-week sprint versus what you might call Kanban. You can deploy Agile in different ways, right? So they all start with a backlog of the work that you need to do, and then you gradually drag that work over from the left to-do bucket to the right done bucket. In the case of a sprint, you take that backlog and you say, here are the things I'm going to work on for this 2 weeks, and you work on them till they're done. In Kanban, you just kind of have a continuous sprint running. You're just always doing what's next and pulling it over. I prefer the 2-week sprint because it forces us to chunk up and think about our capacity and our resources. And it also forces us to make those trade-offs. There's a tendency when you get that interruption, when you get that urgent piece of work that you have to do, to put the long-term work on hold. I'll get to that later when the urgent stuff stops coming in. The urgent stuff never stops coming in. So by time boxing into those 2-week sprints, I find you're able to do that. But a lot of people will say, but our world doesn't work that way. right? Our world moves from a more Kanban style, do what's next. That's a service desk mentality. And a big part of Agile for me is bringing in more of that long-term project-based mentality into this service desk-based world. So it's kind of a mindset shift there for the analysts.
I agree. When you look at Kanban versus sprints, when you think about like an analytics project, well, okay, let's just dial it back and think about what that actually looks like. Well, with a Kanban example for the project, it just doesn't feel right. I kind of understand what you're saying, where you may have, I don't know, 5 columns, as you said, done to do on one side, done on the other, and in the middle you're going to have blockers. And what the tendency is psychologically is if you do something to the blocker, and it's in the blocker where it's not my problem anymore, I have no ownership of that anymore. And then it kind of gets, and then there's this unsatisfactory feeling when the blocker's removed and it gets looped back in. And I guess that's where especially for analytics projects, that the fatigue with Agile will come in very quickly.
So actually, and you were absolutely right. And this is one of the things that I love actually about Agile and the way we're deploying Agile. So time boxing it into these 2 week, in analytics, good answers lead to better questions and more questions. And so there could be a sense, whether it's a blocker or whether it's revisions, the next question, you get this work that never seems to be finished. And so you got all these balls being juggled up in the air, and you're never getting it feels like you're never getting anything done. But the reality is, you feel like you haven't answered this question because you got this one ticket that's stuck, right? Because every time you deliver an answer, that stakeholder answers another, asks another question, right? And so you feel like you're never answering the question. But the reality is you're answering a ton of questions. Breaking it down into Agile, I'm really doing a sell job for Agile here, but it really excites me. And it's one of the things that has helped pick up the morale is when they ask that next question, that's great. We're going to mark the question that we answered done and put the new question back into backlog. And it helps us to prioritize, and it also gives us that sense that we're getting work done, because we are getting work done. And I think that's the biggest thing analysts will struggle with, is the sense that is this never-ending swirl, and work comes in but it never goes out. And the reality is you're getting a ton of stuff done. You're just not taking the victory lap. You're just not getting to check the green check mark that says done. So check it done, take the new question, put it over. Same thing with blockers, right? When it's blocked, keep moving it over.
Yeah. I guess that's the point is that I'm making, is with an actual sprint in Agile, it is just that. It's a kind of like an intense, hardcore. If you imagine an actual runner sprinting, that's the whole point, right? That it's this intense effort, 100 meters, 2 weeks, whatever you want to call it. But then the Kanban, it can feel like this continuous sprint, which by definition isn't going to work, because when you sprint, you run out of energy. Whereas if that for those, I agree with you as well, for the kind of service desk mundane requests, which can be dealt with relatively quickly, absolutely Kanban is great. But when it comes to specifically this on a strategic level, and this is something I want to touch on as well, because you mentioned that on the surface, it looks kind of ironic that, use Agile, use this very heavy process-based system that will free you up for creativity. So right. By definition, those analysts that are more creative-minded aren't going to be the most receptive to using Agile just because of the way it is. But I think that's the key to the data storytelling, and to the data storytellers, and to becoming a data storyteller, is actually balancing that process-orientated mind, which most entry-level graduate data leaders or data engineers, architects, analysts have. They already have this good process base.
That's right.
When, at least over the last few years, but definitely in the next, say, 5 years, the thing that's going to separate the wheat from the chaff, and there's going to be a lot of losers in this space with automation and AI and etc. But the ones who can actually leverage that creativity, who not only are creative but can leverage that creativity in the right way, these are going to be the guys who win, because they have their foot in both camps. So Agile is a really good way to actually do that. I don't want to take the playbook away from you there. I just wanted to kind of give you some thoughts. And one question I did have actually would be, what kind of pushback have you received on this, specifically on the issue of hey, I'm not getting the chance to create here? What kind of questions do you get to you, and what kind of answers would you give?
Yeah, you're exactly right, because the most important story is a story we tell ourselves. And again, yes, it was the biggest mistake I made in the train wreck of my first agile deployment. It was like rah, bah, 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 right, and it just didn't work. Then I realized that agile done right in the analytics context enhances creativity. And the biggest way that enhances creativity, there's actually two ways. Perhaps the biggest is it actually, if done right, it protects the time and the space that the analyst needs in order to be creative. So we're not saying you have 2 weeks to do this analysis end to end, right? What we are saying is you got a piece of analysis, you got a big question to answer, and it's going to take you weeks, of getting data and analyzing data. So just figure out what's next, put that into this 2 week sprint, and you're going to protect the time around that, right? You're going to mark that high priority, you're going to put it to the top of your queue, right? And when that urgent stuff comes in, you're going to say, I can choose this urgent one or this really important needle mover, and I'm going to choose the needle mover. So it enhances creativity by protecting that time. It protects focus. The ideal way that you move things from left to right in a sprint, it doesn't always work this way, of course, but is you only have one item in progress at a time. And that enhances your focus. I can't work on two things at a time. And yes, sometimes I work to something till my time ends, or I got to kind of put it back on the shelf. But it's almost like a library book. I coach my team. You should only ever have one or two things in progress at a time. You got 10 things in the sprint, only one or two of them are in progress, because otherwise they're not in progress because you're not working on them. They're either waiting for others because you're waiting on an input, they're blocked and need attention, or you're actively working on them, which protects that focus. I'd say those are probably the two big ways: is protecting time, protecting focus, that enhances creativity. Yeah,
protecting the creativity. I really like that. So how would you go about actually the rollout phase of something like this then?
Yeah. So it's important to remember we're rolling this out in the context of a stakeholder environment, and your stakeholders are going to have some areas of pushback too. I didn't kind of, to go back to that part of the question, stakeholders sometimes will say, well, 2 week sprints are too long, and they'll try to kind of tell us how to manage our work. Not always, but I've had it happen in other places. That's probably the biggest thing is, well, I'm going to make this request, and you're not going to get around to it till the next 2 week sprint. Like, you think you're a development team or something? And so then we kind of explain to them that, no, we use this agile process, so we understand that like when you make that new request, it might not get addressed this sprint, but then again, it might. And so, it's because that framework. Back to your last question, in terms of actually rolling out, it's important to take a gradual process to this. You're not going to do all the things all at once, right? So, the kind of 3-step process I've had success with is change your team first. Do it on your team before you even tell anybody you're doing it. Then use that to set stakeholder expectations for how they interact with you, and then actually enlist your stakeholders to help and advocate for your program. So when you're rolling out to your team first, it's important to use a good tool like Jira or Azure DevOps, Microsoft's Azure DevOps. Really big fan of ADO. We use Jira. It's good too. But it's also important to remember it's not about the tool. So, which means make it simple. And the big mantra when we were rolling this out is, we are only going to introduce as much process as we absolutely need to get things done. So if this piece of data doesn't help us to get things done, doesn't help us to prioritize, doesn't help us to evaluate effort, we don't need it, right? And then eventually a few things, creep in where you want to kind of prioritize and use labels to help you organize, but really start as simple and as minimal, as bare bones as you can internally. And then explain to your team, I'm a big fan of having a sprint zero. This isn't a real sprint. And it's a real sprint, but you just say, like, look, we're we're just going to try this out and see if it works for us. And if it doesn't work for us, then we're going to use that retrospective time to evaluate what went well, what didn't go well, how we can improve, and then we're going to improve again. And maybe we don't go straight to a sprint 1. It's a sprint 0.5. We're going to beta test our process on ourselves. And all during this time, we're not telling anybody that we're doing anything any different, right? And run it that way for a while. We ran for maybe a quarter or two before we actually told our stakeholders that that's how we were doing business. And the stakeholders started kind of noticing that things were becoming more efficient, and the quality of work was increasing, and we were starting to get compliments. And that's when we moved to the second step, which is set the stakeholder expectations. Okay, here's what we need to do. We're going to roll out now an intake form, right? Because now we're, good work leads to more work. And every time we take in a new request, we got to spend a half hour trying to understand what the request is. So why don't we just give you a form? And people are like, forms? Ooh, that's, like, I just want to dash off an email. Guess what an email is? It's a form. So, so we just had to kind of help set stakeholder expectations, help us, help you. And then when you make that request, know that request goes somewhere. It's not sitting in an inbox. It goes right in our active work queue where we have to deal with it. And, having to deal with it might not mean that it gets done right away. We're going to have to prioritize, and people are reasonable, so they accept that. But it will get prioritized, and it will be put into a sprint. We'll give you a relative idea of where it exists in the backlog. So you don't, and stakeholders love that actually, because it gets really email black hole. Like if you use our form, it goes right into our process. And even though our process is to work in 2-week sprints, and your new request may not make it into this 2-week sprint, it might not even make it into the next 2-week sprint, that it's there. That we have a cadence. And when you think about the way analytics without a process like Agile works anyway, you've got requests that are sitting languishing in your inbox for a month because it's a lower priority, and right? So it just brings all this above board. And then once you set those stakeholder expectations, they start seeing, the benefits of it. Then you enlist the stakeholders to help, and you give them some self-service tools. We run a SharePoint site that I'm quite proud of, and I was looking at how much traffic we're getting to that SharePoint site, and I was shocked, really in a positive way. They're contributing content, they're accessing content, and the stakeholder will begin to kind of advocate for the way that you work. So yeah, but change your team first, and do it quietly is my best advice in terms of rolling it out.
This is so good, because it's time and time again, it's always a question of wanting to, as data analysts and data teams, wanting to build the sexiest, most awesome looking, most amazing, most functional platform, website, whatever that might be. But if no one's going to use it, then it's kind of pointless. And what you've done there is exactly what you should do, which is go where the business is, which is on SharePoint, right? It's not some floozy platform that no one's ever heard of or used before. They don't need to create their own login. They don't need to do a bunch of stuff, action steps that are going to be labor intensive on the brain because it's all new. Whereas if you're using a platform that has already been used, the neural pathways are already carved, so it's significantly easier. Also, talking about stakeholder expectations as well, it reminds me of the concept of data storytellingception, which is the sense that you're trying to tell the story of data to the business, but the key point is actually what kind of story are you selling. You're selling it from the data team, but also what kind of story they're hearing, and then what message is being translated through that. And it sounds like with this, it's exactly what you said. It's keeping it simple. It doesn't matter what tool you use, but it's simple. It's easy. It's easy to use. It's easy to edit. It's easy to understand. And that's why forms work so great. The email black hole is perfect. We're in this day and age where everyone's just so heavy on email, everything gets lost all the time. And when someone sends you, I wouldn't say it's courageous to send a data team an email that you haven't worked before, but it's disheartening if they don't come back.
Yeah, that's right.
And then you just lose interest. You lose the engagement, and then the data team is kind of one step behind before they've even started. So absolutely loved all that. Why don't you tell us about some times where this change went well and maybe didn't go so well when you kind of implemented Agile?
Yeah. So I think, when it went well, we took exactly what I mentioned, right? We took that gradual step. We rolled out, initially, and we really focused on, just really focused on the idea that this is about getting work done. And some amazing things happen. So I'll mention the actual process. We use 4 ceremonies. You can look this up online if you search, Agile Sprint. Some people will have a 5th ceremony. I forget what the 5th was. We don't do it. But you start off the sprint with a sprint planning. So you say, here's, everybody comes to a meeting and says, here's the work that I plan to do, and they share what they're planning to do, what their big goals are for the sprint. We set a main goal for each person, and then we do a daily stand-up. It's not actually daily; it ends up being like every other day or something like that. 15 minutes. Say, are you blocked on anything? And then at the end of the sprint, the 2-week sprint, we'll do a showcase, or the ceremony is often called a sprint review, which is basically where people will volunteer to show off the cool work they've done or the things that they've learned. And we really emphasize collaboration, question asking, and this idea that you don't climb Mount Everest every day. So even the small learnings. The example I like to use is, it's my shame. I'm sitting here coding Perl in about 5 years as a Perl developer, and I graduated with a business degree, in my defense, but I'm sitting here coding in Perl, and this magic thing called Control C and Control V to cut and paste. It took me about 5 years to figure that out. So, somebody told me, hey, you could just Control C, Control V that. And I'm 5 years in. And, I think the assumption was like, a pretty smart guy. He just writes pretty good code. He probably knows cut and paste. Well, I didn't. The thing we do in those stakeholder or in those showcases or sprint reviews is we say, look, you don't have to light up the world. This doesn't have to be a, come down from the mountaintop with your face glowing kind of insight, right? Some of the most mundane things are the most practical. So we do the sprint showcase. The final ceremony in the sprint is a sprint retrospective, which is where we really open the hood and say what went well and what didn't go well. So those are the four ceremonies we follow. You had asked, when it went well. I was and have been shocked. So in our retrospective, we use a tool called Miro, which is kind of an online whiteboard, and we have 4 boxes, and we drop stickies into each box. So we'll take 5 minutes during the sprint retrospective, and you have a little cool little music timer that goes, and we'll fill out these stickies. What went well? What didn't go well? What should we be thinking about, and what will we do? And so, as you can imagine, when you're doing the brainstorming, lots of things are going in the what went well, what didn't go well, and then we have the conversation. That's kind of when we do the what should we be thinking about, and what should we do. I am always shocked how much what went well there was as we go through that. And just objectively, you go back and look at it, taking that thoughtful moment to reflect on the work your team has done has become an essential part of our team and who we are and how we do what we do. Because you're an analyst, again, we talked about that urgency and the feeling like you're never answering the question. It can be easy to feel beat up, and then you come into this sprint retrospective on a Thursday, and you look at what you've done and what all the team has done, and you're like, it's a pretty daggone good sprint, right? You go in going like, oh, I'm just so tired. I feel like it. You look at it, and you're like, holy cow, we got a bunch of stuff done, because you got to reflect, right? And then you notice I said our sprint retrospective is on Thursday. We don't have a sprint open on Friday. Just like you said earlier, sprint evokes this idea of a runner. You can't sprint a marathon, so you sprint real hard, and then you rest, right? So every other Friday is a rest day. We're not taking the day off. We're catching up on email correspondence. We're getting ready and planning the next sprint, for our sprint review, which happens on Monday morning. But the idea is it's a day outside the sprint, and the expectation is, hey man, you ran that sprint, right? That 100-meter dash, and you set a new record. Take a breather, stretching legs, right? So that's what's went really well for us, is just those impacts.
And so a big, obviously not a big, but probably I would argue the biggest part of this is the rollout phase. And even when you're rolling out gradually, you mentioned that you need to enlist the help of stakeholders. So there's one key ingredient here that I'd want to really dive into, which is trust. So what do you think is the importance of trust, and some of the best ways to facilitate that with stakeholders?
Yeah, it's like I said earlier, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care, right? And so really, when you're starting to roll this out, and if you're starting a new role, you get the opportunity to do it, but really just listen, right? And if you're in an environment where you've been there for a while, and now you're gonna bring this change to your team, maybe just a listening session to start off with. You might have Agile in mind, um, but just listen. How can our team serve you better? What kinds of questions do you have that we're not answering? What's your favorite work? Make sure you ask the positive questions too. I would say there's a tendency to try to fill gaps, so we ask, what are we not doing? But what are we doing really well that you would like to see us continue? And just have a listening session, and you will find useful pieces of information, data that comes from that feedback. But the most important thing is that you will establish in your stakeholders' heart that you're a person who listens and cares and wants to share their objectives, right? And then get as excited about their stuff as they are, right? I mean, the ability to contribute to so many ways in businesses is really cool. So listening helps.
So with those listening sessions then, what does that specifically look like for you? Say as a team you want to reach out to, let's say, the sales team to do something. Do you send a bulk email blast to all the sales leaders in Norwegian? Say, hey, we're this team, we're pretty cool. Do you have a different approach, maybe going to corporate and figuring out some of the key players there? What's kind of your strategy for that?
I like to say, 1-to-1, 2-to-2, 3-to-3 kind of thing. I am generally speaking not always a fan of the big broadcast announcement email, like, hey, we're doing Agile now, right? Well, first of all, the world of our stakeholders is in the people who are requesting work of us, at least to start. That universe is pretty small. In fact, when we rolled Agile out here, maybe a half dozen real busy stakeholders and a dozen overall, with maybe another dozen beyond that, that actually interacted with us. So we just kind of quietly rolled out to them through one-on-one conversations. We never sent an email that we're doing Agile. We sent a broadcast email about our SharePoint site because that's something you broadcast. But for rolling out this change, we just kind of did that listening tour and one-to-one. What we found out is, because the system and the process works, we actually are encouraging more stakeholders to engage with us. So we've gone from maybe that, I think I described 24 stakeholders to start with to, now over 80 people, interacting with our intake forms.
Yeah, and with the results you're seeing, what kind of you mentioned that kind of engagement increases. How does that on a practical level influence the wider education of the organization? If you're not doing these huge blasts, obviously not about Agile, I mean just about analytical projects in general and the capabilities of the data team. So when how do you go about from bridging those initial successes to broadcasting to the wider organization without broadcasting to the wider organization? Is it just a case of scaling these 1-on-1s, 2-on-2s, 3-on-3s?
Yeah. For me, and this might be a personal style, right? So my style is definitely more 1-to-1. I thrive in those environments, but then there's also a principle, that I adhere to. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or foolish pride. When you go to dinner, you don't take the seat of honor, right? You take the lowest seat and be asked to pull up. And what that means in this context is broadcasting is important. It has its place, but relationship is more powerful. And broadcast without relationship is entirely empty. What we've found, we've been just truly blessed with, is the idea that if we do good work, people are going to find out. I mean, in the marketing world, we know that the most powerful form of marketing remains, even in this day of digital, remains word of mouth. And so if you do good work, people are going to tell you, people are going to find out. You end up not having to broadcast quite as much. And again, there are announcements and certain things that you have to broadcast. I'm going to say never broadcast, but I found that 1-to-1, that relationship, that sincerity of caring about what people do and then doing great work is people will find out.
So good. So it's so funny because you said that broadcast without relationship is kind of nothing. But relationship without the broadcast has so much power in and of itself. It's all about quality over quantity, right? In this case, And then, as you said, that when the word gets out, that it gets scaled. And what you're talking about is essentially a key component of data storytelling, which is relationship building and influence, kind of tied hand in hand, which then creates this powerful messaging for data analytics leaders.
Yes.
In these big organizations, which is great and perfect. And I think that this is a really strong playbook in the sense that it's very unique. We don't really talk about it too much, but I think it definitely has its place. And I think that it's definitely a tool that, because, when you mentioned Agile, when we spoke before, I was a bit conscious that we were really going to be going down like a very process orientated, nitty gritty, but actually you can see very well how that blends in, how that creates this cocktail for success, let's call it. So with your particular role then, how do you see your role in the organization? If you had to describe it, would you call yourself an evangelist, a change agent, something else?
Probably both of those things. I kind of view myself as, candidly, I more as a servant, helper, facilitator, supporter. Those are kind of I was described more by adjectives. I feel like yes, evangelism is part of it, but I'm not just evangelizing to evangelize the gospel of data, right? I really am here to help people get stuff done. And one of the things I ask in all of my interviews, so if you ever interview with me for a job, you're going to expect it. 10 years I've asked this question is, how do you define leadership? And I define leadership as making the people around you better in a way that helps accomplish a mission. I've had 10 years to kind of polish and burnish that.
The elevator pitch is perfect now.
Yeah, right. Just no wasted words. But really, it's about helping the people around you better. And so, because if you want to help the organization grow, if you want to help the people in the organization grow, that means you're gonna have to advocate for your change. You're gonna have to evangelize, but then you're gonna have to get in the trenches and care about what people are working on and help them get along their way too. So, yeah. That's kind of how I define it.
Well, Aaron, it's been a genuine pleasure to have you on the show today. Lots of thought-provoking stuff. Last question for you. What advice would you give for aspiring leaders in data and analytics and data science?
Yeah, it's going to go back to a Twitter conversation I had a long time ago. It's
X.
all about
I guess it was
people.
Twitter then.
Yeah, it's Twitter. Yeah, it's all about people. It's all about people. And the follow-on to that is hearts change slower than minds. So if you want to change the mind, you got to focus on changing the heart. And it's a little bit counterintuitive, maybe, understand the business context and, form relationships, but really it is all about people and knowing that hearts change slower than minds.
Absolutely. Well, Aaron, it's been, as I said, a pleasure having you on the show. I'm sure we'll dive much deeper into this over the coming years, and I'm going to be excited to continue following what you're doing.
Anytime. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.